Philosophers talk to our times. We, the citizens of dystopia. One of the things to live in a dystopia is to live in the ruins of your own conceptual history, where things that were once spun as nuanced and negative are turned into forces of positivity and potential future. I remember when it first happened, I couldn't believe that austerity was going to be marketed as something that we wanted. What, really? As if Keynes had never lived or died. And even more is the much abused concept of the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution is one of those things, its history is always other than you think it is. And yet, of course, everything, every major change is packaged as the next Industrial Revolution. Yeah, right then. So in the course of my life, I think it's been the microchip. That was going to be our Industrial Revolution. And then it was certainly going to be genes, and then it was going to be 3D printing, and now it's AI. So which is it? Or is it all of them? I'll give you a clue. If anything, it's all of them. And the Industrial Revolution is then repackaged as the white-hot heat of technology that will change our lives for the better? What, really? Is that what you think the concept of the Industrial Revolution was? A force for good, transforming Britain over the course of, 90 years or so? From what to what? Oh, the Britain in the 1740s was no picnic. I don't think I would argue that it was a picnic. It was a fundamentally peasant society with an aristocracy floating on the top, with more wealth probably then than at any other time since the Black Death. But still, fundamentally a poor society, crisscrossed with cultural prejudice. And by, 1860, it was a largely urban society, where all these skilled jobs had gone, where the main workforce were children and women, forced to work or to starve. A world then that had replaced subsistence agriculture with necessitous poverty and the Spiegelhand system, a system of systematic starvation. If you had taken someone in the 1720s, say, and said, this will happen in the next century if only you vote for the Industrial Revolution, I doubt they would have been voted for the Industrial Revolution. I know I wouldn't. So I have no idea why you think that such a long-term but terribly destructive force is something so immensely positive and life-changing. If there was a real Industrial Revolution akin to the one that began in the 1740s, it is certain those alive now would never live to see its prosperity. Not at all. But of course, history is never that simple. That simple truth that I was brought up with, that the Industrial Revolution was thoroughly nuanced. That the contrast between the poverty seen most easily, and the contrast in the poverty in Mansfield Park in Portsmouth, which is an industrialising community, but not quite there yet, and the utter grinding poverty in Bleak House. That difference in poverty would not be something anyone would wish upon anyone in particular. The idea then that the Industrial Revolution is this positive powerhouse is clearly problematic. But to be honest with you, as with all great revolutionary ideas, the idea of the Industrial Revolution is far more nuanced if you actually look at what happened. For instance, it's worth remembering, the phrase Industrial Revolution was not a phrase that the British used to describe their economic changes. There was an increase in manufacture, sure. There was a change in social order, yeah, we'll come back to that. But the process took so long and involved so many different processes, so many different parts, so many different aspects, that it doesn't really get coordinated into a thing. Not in Britain. The first advocates of the idea of the Industrial Revolution are, of course, French, trying to understand in the course of the Napoleonic Wars why Britain is doing so incredibly well. Why, in 1812, it can appear to stand against all the rest of Europe and America and not be humiliated. It was very clear the laws of power had shifted. And so the Industrial Revolution was a way of trying to understand the revolution that Britain had from France's perspective, that was so different. That's right. The concept of the Industrial Revolution has a very Hobsbawmian, I suppose, birth. It was created as a concept by the French, trying to understand why the British were so effective. And so you have the two revolutions of Hobsbawm, both created in France as a concept. And then it gets used by Engels and Marx in German in the 1840s to describe in German what was beginning to happen in Germany. The enforced, self-conscious mechanization of a nation. So the Industrial Revolution was not something that happened in Britain, but rather it was something that happened elsewhere, who were trying to emulate on a compressed time frame what Britain had done, or what they thought it had done. They were therefore industrializing, and there is an industrial revolution, I think it is probably truthful to say, in Germany in the 1840s, 50s, 60s and 70s, up to about 1880, that turned Germany from the dream house of Europe into the powerhouse that led to the First World War. It was a major sequence of changes over a short period of time, self-consciously willed. That was a real industrial revolution. But of course it was a second generation industrial revolution. It was looking at what they thought had happened in Britain and aping it. It's interesting, the idea in Britain doesn't become popular until 1881, and a historian called Toynbee, Arnold Toynbee, who vulgarizes, he does a very famous series of lectures, and I think a book, that make everybody know about the concept of the Industrial Revolution. That's when it gets kind of hardwired into the way the British understand their own history. But of course, the actual sequence of changes over nearly 80 years were not an industrial revolution. Not if you understand it in terms of the cotton mills of Manchester and the final ends of an urbanised world full of steam trains. At the beginning, it began rather differently. It's worth noticing that the cotton mills in Manchester didn't always run at a profit. Some of them ran at quite a loss. Big factories weren't the most effective way of organising, mechanising labour. Rather, they tended to be organised in terms of small workshops. Not the kind of workshops that Adam Smith had trumpeted, where every man had his skill. The de-skilling happened. But from a lot of industries other than cotton, the norm was small workshops, each that did a bit of the process, and journeymen who took the process from one to t'other. Not localised then in a great big factory that produced this thing at this time. But then there's little capitalists making their little pile, de-skilling a certain workforce. The image then was not of big industry, but little. Not big change, but little change. Oh, pernicious. Layer upon layer de-skilling workforces, demanding people change their lives. But was it the industrialisation that drove urbanisation in Britain? Or was it the enclosures? My memory, now this is a long memory and I haven't double checked this, so you probably want to go and check it yourself, because I actually haven't. But my memory is that it's the enclosures that start to happen, in the 1740s, that really push the need for industrialisation, because it creates what had never existed before, an urban revolutionary poor. Therefore, industrialisation was also a name for how you were understood, how you used these poor, how you found them work to go to. They could work in the new industries, in inverted commas, totally de-skilling themselves, so that the artisans of the generation before became the unskilled poor labour. But that would have been unthinkable, not without the agrarian revolution, therefore. The agrarian revolution that made the marginal common land of Britain suddenly profitable. So the rich enclosed it and stole it. The Industrial Revolution, as we know it, begun, therefore, with quite a different act of theft that drove it forwards. Nor was it a simple linear process. On the contrary, after the end of the Napoleonic War, politicians as great as Peel looked at Britain and how it was declining, and how the manufacturers weren't going how they thought they ought to have gone, from strength to strength, but were rather, as Marx noted, endlessly in perpetual slight decline, and then sudden growth, and then another decline. And Peel wrote that he thought the Industrial Revolution was that the change in manufacturers, the increase in Britain's power, was over. It was done with. And that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. But there was no ordained process that was going to lead to the Industrial Revolution. Not in Britain, not as they understood it. It was a process always looked on from outside. And that is, of course, what makes it such a wonderfully dystopic notion for our day. When somebody trumps, AI will be the next Industrial Revolution, one sits there and thinks, what on earth do you mean? Well, what you really mean is that you're Frederick Engels looking at Britain and going, well, that's an Industrial Revolution there, so they're now doing it in Germany. You are part of understanding the way other people. You are understanding the Industrial Revolution from without, but you're trying to imply it from within. Does that make sense to you? So the concept of the Industrial Revolution, as it was formulated in other lands than Britain. Other lands than that underwent it. And if you are trumpeting a sequence of changes as the next Industrial Revolution, you're using an idea that was already alienated from the sequence of processes, disjointing it in time and applying it to another sequence of processes. But it is also, but this time it is not disjoint from, but is somehow caught up within the politics of. I suppose what I mean by all of that statement is this isn't history repeating itself, because it doesn't work that way. The first history was terribly complicated. And this history, it's terribly complicated too. It shares with the Industrial Revolution perhaps one main feature. That is, the Industrial Revolution was part of a way that humans re-understood their very humanity. The humanity of an artisan, defined by what a body could do, was always caught up in certain notions of the soul, of having to be oneself alone, because it was through one's power, through one's ability to conceive, that one operated, that one was useful to one's fellow men. So one's individuality and one's powerfulness were caught up within each other. So one was an artisan, one was a peasant, one used one's knowledge, is what I mean by that. And of course that wasn't true for the Industrial Revolution. It changed the conception of how humans understood themselves, so that Darwinian evolution, where you improve a little bit at a time, becomes a thing. Because factories, or even whether they were big factories or little workshops, were all about just doing one task, getting good at one task, one thing at a time. So humans changed the way they understood what they were. They became a rag bag of different facets, rather more than a soul. And I have no doubt that in the long term, that thing we are calling AI and trumpeting as a revolution will have the same effect upon ourselves. Large chunks of our mind get hypothecated, pulled off, something else will do that, and we'll be left with a rag bag of thoughts, the jingle jangle of things that we want to keep within our own ideas, as we in this model pull out what we are and allow others, I mean computers, to sort it out. So maybe like that it is like an Industrial Revolution. But an Industrial Revolution is never simple. It is never like itself. If you wanted me to put money on what the future Arnold Toynbee in what? 2060? If such a time be, and humans are in such a time, He wouldn't think of AI as the industrial revolution. He would merely think of it as one of the processes of that technological sequence of revolutions that begun in 1980 with the microchip and has carried on ever since, that sweeps up a society and changes how it understands its very humanity. Absolutely. But what that will do, how that will affect humanity, beyond saying it is certainly not a positive force. It is a destructive force, a force that won't necessarily lead to anything particularly good, and that will just simply change the world so it is unthinkable to change it back, maybe. So it is not something to be advocated as a positive sweeping up change or a political agenda. More than that, my very suspicion that the very fact that it does get advocated as a political agenda probably relegates it in terms of historical forces. Historical self-conscious forces are famously inept. Their very self-consciousness tends to disprove their own reality. At least, that is my experience. You can ape what has been, self-consciously, but looking forward to something new, something that will break a society self-consciously, by definition, you can't do that. So the very drive to make AI an industrial revolution is good, more likely than not, in terms of the politics, to destroy its potentiality and lead us into some sort of new dystopia, where something that was promised as a major change that changes the way that we understand ourselves is misunderstood through its own politics, where we don't really understand what it is doing, only the politics of what we have been told that it is doing, which is a pity, because in another life, understood properly, I suspect AI is rather useful. It's just not in this world, not in this dystopia, not at this time.